Tonight's story was sent to me by someone who asked to remain anonymous. As always, names and locations have been changed. Whether you believe it is entirely up to you. Dan had made this same drive for 6 years running. Same servo in Colac for a coffee and a full tank. Same turn off the highway onto the Aero Valley Road, where the phone signal gave up before the tarmac did. Same feeling every time of the world getting quieter with each kilometre of forest closing in around the car. He liked it that way. 2 nights a year where nobody expected anything from him and nobody could reach him even if they wanted to. His mates thought it was strange, going out alone when he could easily talk someone into coming along. He'd stopped trying to explain it. It wasn't about getting away from people exactly. It was about the quiet only working properly when there was no one else there to fill it. He always stopped at Hopetoun Falls first, even though he'd seen it a dozen times before. It felt like a kind of checkpoint, one last dose of other people before he wouldn't see any for 2 days. This time of the afternoon, there were still a few tourists picking their way down the 200-odd steps, phones out, someone's kid complaining loudly about the climb back up. By the time he reached the bottom, the boardwalk had nearly cleared out, just him and 30 metres of water falling through ferns that had probably been there since before the road existed. He didn't stay long. The light was already turning soft and grey through the canopy, and he still had the better part of an hour's walk ahead of him before his own sight came back into view. Past the falls, the track changed under his boots. Fewer people had worn it in. The dry eucalypt gave way properly to rainforest. Tree ferns crowded the path from both sides. Moss grew thick enough to swallow the sound of his own footsteps. The air turned cold and wet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. He crossed the creek twice on the way in, both times on logs he trusted more than he probably should have. He knew this stretch well enough to walk the last 20 minutes without his torch, right up until the canopy closed over completely and there simply wasn't enough light left to justify not using it. His sight was exactly where he'd left it the last time. A flat shelf of ground above the creek. Far enough off the main track that day, walkers never stumbled onto it. Close enough to water that he never had to carry much of it in, tent up before full dark, fire going not long after. And then for a while, nothing to do but sit with it. Wood smoke, the cold pressing in past the flames, the particular kind of quiet that a forest like this never actually delivers. The bush at night out here always sounded busier than people expected. Something moved through the undergrowth on the far side of the creek, unhurried, heavy enough to be a wombat. Somewhere further up the valley, a boobook owl ran through its call a few times and gave up. Closer to the ridge, a sugar glider let out its odd little bark, and something heavier coughed back at it from further off. And once, only once, something let out a long, wavering cry that could have passed for a woman screaming, "If you didn't know better." He knew better. Barking owl. He'd heard that exact call more times than he could count over 6 years of coming out here, and it barely registered as anything anymore, just one more voice in a valley full of them. He fed the fire, ate, and didn't think about it again. By the time he crawled into the tent, the cold had properly set in, the kind that found its way into his hands before it found anywhere else. He zipped the vestibule most of the way shut, left his knife hanging in its sheath from the loop just inside the flap, exactly where it always sat, and was asleep before he'd had time to register how completely dark it had gotten outside the thin nylon wall by his head. The first night passed the way it always did out here. Quiet. Uneventful. Nothing worth writing down. If he'd ever been the kind of person who wrote things down, it would be the last night that was true. Morning came in grey and slow, the kind of light that took an hour to properly arrive under a canopy this thick. Dan had the billy on before he'd properly decided to get up, the ritual doing most of the deciding for him. Somewhere above the mist, a couple of currawongs were already going at it. The daylight version of the valley's noise, ordinary and almost comforting after a night of the other kind. 2 days like this a year, and he still never got tired of it. Coffee in one hand, nothing on the agenda except staying exactly where he was. It was pulling the fire apart that he noticed at first. He always built the ring the same way, flat stones stacked too high on the windward side, and he remembered doing exactly that the night before. This morning the top stone had shifted, turned almost a quarter circle, resting at an angle he was fairly sure he hadn't left it at. He picked it up, turned it over once in his hand, like the underside might tell him something, then set it back down roughly where it had been. He put the whole thing down to being half asleep when he'd built it, or to not trusting his own memory as much as he usually did. 6 years out here, and it had never really needed checking before. He found the print a little before midday, cutting back through the ferns after topping up his water. A single boot mark in a soft patch of mud just off the main track, deep enough to hold its shape. He crouched over it longer than he meant to, running a thumb along the edge of the tread, some chunky, aggressive pattern that wasn't close to anything he owned. It came from the wrong direction too, angled in from the scrub, rather than off the path he'd walked in on. Could have been a ranger doing the rounds, he told himself. Could have been some other walker who drifted off track without meaning to. Nobody was supposed to know this exact spot, but plenty of people knew the general area, and one stray print wasn't much to build a story out of. The food canister gave him more pause than the print had. It sat maybe 20 centimetres from where he always left it, latch still done up, nothing missing, nothing chewed, nothing dragged. An animal would have made a mess of it, or given up on the smell, and left it alone entirely. This looked like something had picked it up, considered it, and put it back down almost exactly where it found it. Almost. For a second he actually thought about packing up early, calling the trip and walking out while there was still good light, and then he thought about how that would sound, explained out loud to anyone, and didn't. He didn't decide to start testing things so much as just find himself doing it. A thin stick laid flat across the narrow point where the track opened into his sight, easy enough to miss unless you already knew to look for it. The angle of a fist-sized rock by the tent door, memorized down to which way its flattest face was pointing. A line scratched into the dirt by the fire ring itself, small enough that only he'd know it was there. If nothing came through tonight, he'd know by morning that his own eyes had been the only thing playing tricks on him. The rest of the day went the way most days out here went, at least on the surface. He fished the deep pool below the second creek crossing for an hour and caught nothing worth keeping. Read for a while with his back against a log, losing his place more than once. Told himself more than once that he was reading too much into 3 small things that all had ordinary explanations. By the time the light started turning soft and grey again, he'd mostly talked himself back down. Mostly. He built the fire a little bigger than he needed to that night, and didn't look too closely at why. He went through the motions of a normal second night, same as always. Dinner eaten a little earlier than usual. Fire built bigger than it needed to be. He told himself that was just about the cold, and didn't examine it any harder than that. By the time he zipped himself into the tent, the valley had gone through its usual evening noise and settled into the particular kind of quiet that came after it. He lay there longer than he meant to before sleep actually took him. He woke to it rather than heard it arrive, which was somehow worse, some hour deep enough into the night that the fire outside had burned down to nothing but coals. Something moving, close, deliberate, nothing like the careless crash of an animal working through undergrowth. He lay still and listened, his hand already on the torch, before he'd properly decided to reach for it. He unzipped the flap slow enough that it barely made a sound and swept the torch out across the tree line. Nothing, just the usual wall of ferns and dark, the beam only carrying so far before the forest simply ate it. He told himself the same thing he told himself every other night out here. Wombat, probably. Maybe a wallaby working the far side of the creek. Then it came again, further off this time, that same long wavering cry he'd written off as a barking owl the night before. He waited for the certainty to arrive the way it had the first time. It didn't. He zipped the flap back up and lay there with the torch still in his hand, told himself he knew exactly what that sound was, said the words barking owl in his head, like saying them enough times, would make the feeling in his chest agree. It didn't fully work, but eventually his body stopped asking his permission. Somewhere past that, without ever really deciding to, he slept. The stick across the track was the first thing he checked. Before he'd even properly stood up, snapped clean in the middle, exactly where something would have had to step to get through. The rock by the tent door had turned, its flat face pointing somewhere it had never pointed in 6 years of him checking things like that. The line scratched into the dirt by the fire ring had been walked straight through the centre of it. He didn't need to check the sheath by the vestibule to know before he looked. Empty, the strap still hanging exactly where it always sat. He stood there a long moment doing the maths on that, on how close something had needed to get to reach it without him waking at all. He found it about 4 meters out, driven into the trunk of a blackwood at roughly chest height, angled so that whoever slept in that tent would be looking straight at it the moment they stepped outside. Nothing had been taken from him, nothing had been damaged. Whatever had been through his camp overnight hadn't wanted his knife, and hadn't wanted his food, and hadn't wanted anything he actually owned. It had wanted him to know exactly how close it had gotten while he slept, and that it hadn't needed the knife to do whatever it wanted instead. He didn't stand in front of that tree as long as he probably should have. There wasn't much use in it. 6 years of being the person who stayed level-headed when something went wrong had taught him that packing up a camp doesn't actually require having worked out what happened first, so he broke it down the way he always broke it down. Methodical, nothing left behind, nothing forgotten. His hands not quite steady the whole time, but steady enough to get the job done. He didn't look for tracks leading away from the tree. He didn't walk the perimeter looking for more of them. Whatever had been through his camp overnight wasn't something he had any intention of going looking for, and some quiet, practical part of him understood that clearly enough not to argue with it. The walk out felt longer than the walk in had, though it was the same track, the same hour, roughly reversed. The rainforest thinned back into eucalypt the same way it always did. The light got easier the closer he got to the falls, and by the time he reached them, there were tourists again. Actual daylight tourists. Phones out, someone's kid complaining about the steps. Exactly the way there had been 2 days earlier. He stood at the bottom of it for a minute longer than he needed to, listening to people who had no idea what an ordinary morning sounded like until you'd spent a night without one. He looked back once before the track bent away from the ridge for good. He'd half expected to see something at the tree line, and some part of him almost wanted to, just to have it confirmed as something rather than nothing. There was nothing there. Somehow that was worse. He hasn't been back to that site since, and doesn't plan to. He still thinks sometimes about exactly how close something would have needed to get to reach that knife without him waking, and about the particular choice involved in giving it back instead of using it. He doesn't have an answer for either of those things. He stopped expecting to find one. That's the version of it. He's comfortable telling what happened after he told it to somebody else, and how it ended up here isn't really his to explain. You have been listening to Coal After Dark, where every story begins with something familiar and ends somewhere you never expected to go. If you enjoyed tonight's story, make sure to subscribe and join us for more slow burn horror, unsettling mysteries, and stories designed for the quiet hours of the night. Until next time, keep the lights on, check the doors, and remember, some places are forgotten, but some places never forget you. Good night.